Assalamu everyone. If everyone can have a seat and file in, we'll get the program started shortly. So, good evening everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight at our event, Creating the Other, the Muslim American Experience. I hope that you all find today's event a very informative experience and moreover, a transformative experience. Our esteemed panel consists of Dr. Hatem Bazian and Mr. Rashad Hussain, about whom you will hear more from our moderator, Professor Muzaffar. Professor Muzaffar holds 2 MAs from the University of Chicago from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and from the Master of Liberal Arts program. His research interests include the Quran, Islamic intellectual history, comparative religions, and mysticism. He's a 2011 Humanities, Arts, and Sciences recipient of the Graham School's Excellence in Teaching Award. He's a lifelong member of the Chicago Muslim community, and he is one of Roger Ebert's far-flung correspondents writing film reviews. Now, inshallah, we will start today's event with a Quran recitation by Yusuf Ahmed, followed up by a translation by Hagar Goma. If I can have both of them up on the stage, please.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا.
O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm in justice, witness for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or parents and relatives. Whether one is rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclination, lest you not be just, and distort your testimony or refuse to give it. Then indeed, Allah is ever with what you do acquainted.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Okay, let me try this again. This is the greeting of the people of paradise. Assalamu alaikum. Much better. Okay. So my assignment for today is to be your moderator with our esteemed panel of guests. We have Rashad Hussain, who since 2010 has been the U.S. envoy appointed by President Obama to the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. And we also have Professor Hatem Bazian, who is from the University of California. And without further ado, I want to run right into the conversation. Each of them will speak for 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. Someone from the MCSA will be wandering around offering you little index cards. Where is that person? Right here. Index cards and pens if you would like to write on a question, which will eventually be sent up to me for the Q&A period. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you Mr. Rashad Hussain.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. It's very nice to be back in Chicago. I have some roots here myself, having studied here the Quran at IIE, and having married into Chicago, my wife Isra, who's here, who studied at the University of Chicago, and her family, my father-in-law, who worked in this area when he came to the United States in Evanston, and so this has been kind of a home for me, and I appreciate Dr. Omar and the others who have invited us, Sister Tahira, who we had last year around this time, well, getting close to this time at the White House for our iftar, and all the other brothers and sisters who are doing such great work with the association, Brother Baber and others. We really appreciate the invitation. I thought I would start off a little bit by just talking about my personal background, because I think it's one that's very similar to everybody in this room. My family is from India. My father grew up in a small village in the state of Bihar, which is a very poor state, in a village without any electricity. He came to the United States in 1969 looking for work. He was an engineer, and he moved to Wyoming, of all places, where he was working as a mining engineer. My mother came to the United States 6 years later. She's a physician, OBGYN, and we moved to Texas when I was 1 or 2 years old in 1980. And that's where I grew up for most of my life. Went to high school there. And growing up in a South Asian family, as I'm sure some of you can relate to here, that expectation is that you either go into medicine or you go into engineering. And so those were kind of the options that I had considered or led to believe were kind of the options that I would pursue through my studies. But when I was in high school, I became active in a lot of different things and activities, and one of them was debate, where we did a lot of policy research, legal research. So I became very interested in government, and I became very interested in law, and I thought that I would try to pursue those for my career path. At the same time, like many of you, every weekend and during the days in the summer and a couple of nights a week during the school year, we would go to the masjid or have our teacher for Islam and Islamic sciences teach us Quran and Hadith and Sirah, Fiqh. And so that was very much a part of my life growing up. And it's something that I also pursued in graduate school as well. But I always had this sense that I wanted to do public service in government and was interested in law. Now, I think it's really important to mention that when you make those decisions and you're living in a place like the United States, where people come to from all over the world because it is a place of opportunity, there's so many ways that you can serve. There's so many different fields that you can go into to serve the country. And to serve, if you're Muslim, obviously, to serve the greater good, and there's many issues that the Muslim community in the United States is facing, and to serve the community. And so it's very difficult sometimes. I can relate to that, trying to decide which path to go down. Medicine is obviously a very noble course. There's something very rewarding about tangibly having an impact on someone's life on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes in a life-saving basis. And it's a very attractive field. The engineering, all the great things that you can do with that. The arts and sciences, the schools of arts and sciences, all the fields that you can study. There's so many different things. And so it's sometimes very challenging. And so that was the kind of sense that I had of the area that I wanted to pursue, but always in a way which I thought that I would try to maintain attachments to the communities that I've grown up with. I've been part of the Muslim community growing up since I can remember, and I've been at many of the same conventions and lectures and speeches that you all have been on, just like you, sitting in the audience and listening and trying to think about the future and what should be done. But there is an essential role to be played in all of these fields. And in this job, we interact with people that are working in academia, people that are working in law on both sides in the government, and then you have people that are working, for example, in the civil liberties community. You have people that are working in advocacy organizations, and some of my closest friends work in these groups, and every day when I talk to them, I tell them how much I appreciate, because the way that our system is set up, every profession or every community of people has a role to play, and that's how our country functions. If you don't have the media serving as a check on things that the government is doing, you have problems. If you don't have advocacy organizations, civil liberties organizations that that provide checks on not just the government but things that are happening in society, then you have problems. If you don't have the strongest people that are in the medical profession, then the society breaks down at another level. And so it's important to remember that there are so many different paths to go down, and all of them are paths that involve service and are productive, and they're all paths in which we integrate in the best possible way. And the term civic engagement is often thrown out a lot, and I understand the value of that term, but to me, being involved in any of these fields and serving the country, serving the people that are around you, that's what we're asked to do, and that's our obligation. And so, whichever path you choose, there is a strong and necessary role to be played, and if it's done with that intention, then there's, inshallah, success in any of those decisions that are made. So when I went to college, I had a sense that I wanted to study law, and I had an interest in philosophy, so I studied philosophy and political science in college, and then did take some time to do the degree in Islamic studies at the university. All my training had been kind of the traditional studies, and so I wanted to see what the university experience was like. I had some time that I graduated early from college, and so I did that. And during that time, I maintained my interest in government, did an internship working on Capitol Hill in one of the summers for the person that was the House minority leader at the time, who was Richard Gephardt from Missouri. Now, the reason why I mention that is because that actually has a very instrumental role in how I would, get further involved in government later on. Let me tell you a little bit about how that internship came about first. It was in the late 90s. There was a commission that was being set up to study issues of counterterrorism. And the way that the commission was set up was that the president at the time would get to appoint a few people to that commission. The Republicans in Congress would get to, the Democrats in Congress would get to as well. So one of the persons that the Democrats appointed, and Representative Gephardt, who I worked for as an intern, who I later worked for as an intern, was one of the people that was making that decision along with the House Minority Whip, who was David Bonnier from Michigan. So they appointed somebody from the Muslim community to be on that commission, and there was some tactics that were used, to indict the person that was selected. And so eventually they pulled that nomination back. And so there was a group of people from Michigan in the Muslim community that was organized, and they objected to that, and they sat down with those members of Congress, and they said, look, we don't agree with what you've done here, but you've made the decision, so we would appreciate if you take some steps to address this in the future. So one of the things that they did is they said that we'll try to bring on some staff people, some interns to increase the involvement of people in government from a younger age. So it turns out that, long story short, I was the intern that was brought in to assume that role. Now, by the way, this person who was kind of cut out from the process is now a major leader in the American Muslim community. Has been engaged with the government at the highest levels. Has been at the White House a number of times. In this administration, previous administration. So that kind of attempt to cut him out, it had some, I think, short-term impact, but he's been a part of the advocacy process since then as well. And they also, created a situation in which they planted a seed for somebody else like myself to get involved in government. And so when I took on that role, one of the people that I worked for in that internship, and this is I'm like 19, 20 years old, and was in my first real experience working in government, that person was handling the judiciary issues for the House Minority Leader at the time. And nobody knew who Barack Obama was at that time, really, but she also happened to be one of President Obama's classmates in law school. So I was working for her on judiciary issues, and I kept in touch with her, later and down the line, and that has an impact on the trajectory that my career took later on. But after I completed that internship, I developed a good relationship with her on judiciary issues, and she recommended me to work on the House Judiciary Committee, which is a committee in Congress that handles a lot of judiciary, constitutional, legal issues. And so after I finished my graduate school program, I took on that job to work on the House Judiciary Committee, and it was in 2000 and 2001, during which time, of course, the September 11, 2001 attacks took place. We were working on Capitol Hill that day, and we all know the stories, evacuations, and what happened. Then after that, legislation quickly came through Congress, the Patriot Act. I was working on the Democratic side of the committee. We were working on compromise legislation that would take away a lot of the worst civil liberties aspects of the Patriot Act at the time, and actually crafted a really good compromise that passed unanimously out of committee by both Republicans and Democrats. But then when the bill came to the floor, the administration just took the original bill and kind of scuttled the compromise that was reached that had taken out a lot of those harmful aspects from the civil liberties perspective. And so I was working on issues there, legal issues, constitutional issues, and doing that while applying to law school. And after I completed that job, I went to law school, and during law school did a graduate program in government as well. And after finishing that, I clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for a judge named Judge Keith, who is kind of a giant from the civil rights era in Detroit. I should also mention that it's very interesting. The woman that I worked for, African-American woman that I mentioned that was a classmate of President Obama, she put me in touch with the Judiciary Committee. The person that I worked for in the Judiciary Committee, Congressman John Conyers, who's the ranking member and later the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, African-American member of Congress from Detroit. And then the judge that I worked for, African-American judge from the civil rights era, who's still serving at age 91 on the U.S. Court of Appeals. After that clerkship, I started working in the Justice Department in the Civil Division in a bureau called Federal Programs. And federal programs handle a lot of constitutional issues that arise with federal legislation or federal programs that have been implemented. And it was only a couple months working only a couple months into that job when the 2008 election happened and President Obama was elected. And when President Obama was elected, he had a small transition team, and it just so happened that the woman that he selected to be general counsel of the transition team was the same woman that I worked for when I was an intern on Capitol Hill, his classmate from law school. And she brought me on to the legal team of the transition team. I was working in the Justice Department. After that experience, I interviewed with a lot of the lawyers. There was a few lawyers on the transition team, and one of the things that we wanted to do was possibly continue the administration, possibly continue the White House. So I interviewed with the White House counsel that had been appointed, Greg Craig, and began working in the White House counsel's office. When I was working on the transition team, it was on various legal issues, and then when I started working in the White House counsel's office, it was on national security issues, issues regarding new media, which is the government's presence on the internet, the rules that it's a new area of law. Because in the president's campaign, as you know, they're very active with social media. So when you go from being a campaign to then a transition, which is a quasi-governmental entity, you have certain things that you can and can't do online. And then when you're a full government entity, then there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do online as a government in terms of endorsement, in terms of compliance with disabilities laws and things like that. So I was working on those issues, and I was working on national security issues and issues of science and technology, which I did for over the first year that I was in the administration. But it was during the first week, I believe, of the administration. I was having a conversation with the White House counsel, and he was just talking to us individually about what we wanted to do as lawyers in the office. And one of the things that I mentioned to him, in addition to the areas that I had been working on, was that I have a background in Islamic studies, in Arabic, and it may not be squarely within some of the discussions that we're having right now regarding Guantanamo, but it could be a relevant perspective to help out on some of those issues that we were working, as I was working on some of those cases, trying to move the detainees out from Guantanamo. And so the White House counsel immediately took me down to meet with the person who's now the President's chief of staff. At that time, he was the Deputy National Security Advisor, and he was organizing or getting ready for this trip that the President had committed to making the first 100 days of delivering a major address with the Muslim world. And so it was like the first week, and he asked me, where do you think we should do this? And we talked about some ideas. It ended up that the first trip was to Turkey. That didn't quite fit squarely with the message, fully with the message that we wanted to deliver. And the President wanted to do something in Cairo, which we decided had been one of the candidates for the first trip, but we decided later on that we would do a second trip as well. So I became more involved in working on those issues kind of informally while I was working as a lawyer and advising on that set of issues. And it's really, it's really interesting because you go to the topic of what's on the projector. And the reason why I think it's interesting is because my whole kind of academic career and throughout my professional career, what I've tried to do, as many of you have tried to do, is just work with the people around you. They have questions, answer their questions, be who you are, be confident in who you are. Don't hold yourself back by otherizing yourself and failing to engage because of perceived obstacles that we put in front of our own selves, that we kind of create an otherization by ourselves. And this question, if it gets asked me about the other, what do you do to combat the other, I would just ask you on a day-to-day basis, what do you do? If you talk to students, for example, if you travel in other parts of the world, you might get questions similar to the one that's on the projector. They might say, how can you study as a Muslim in the United States? Are you allowed to practice your religion? Are you allowed to do this? Are you allowed to do that? How can you survive after 9/11? And you would look at them and you'd say, are you kidding me? I mean, these are the people that I've gone to school with since I was a kid. I played sports with them. I have been in clubs with them, reading club, math club, science club, all types of activities. And that's what we do. We get to know each other better. They ask me questions. I ask them questions. We have a good time. And you'd be kind of taken aback. And so sometimes when I get to ask these types of questions, I get the same feeling, which is I came in as a lawyer and was kind of doing my work, and there were some issues that are pertinent to the Muslim world. People became interested. You're a Muslim, you have a background in this area. And so people begin to ask questions. That happens up to this day, where we just walk around each other's offices and people say, hey, what about this? What about that? And it's a beneficial process where we hear each other's perspectives, and hopefully it can be an educational process. I certainly learn a lot from having these types of discussions. And that's not to say that there aren't problems that are out there. There are problems. There's been problems for minority communities, not just in the United States, but minority communities are all around the world, and in societies all around the world. That's a part of how societies function, and even in democratic societies. I mean, if you look at the situation of minorities living in various parts of the world, including the Muslim world, you'll see that this is a challenge in a lot of different places. And even in our history, we've overcome a lot of challenges. And previous communities that we should continue to learn from have overcome challenges that are much greater than the communities that the Muslim community is facing. And because of the great work that they have done and in setting forth a lot of strong precedent for protection of rights of minorities and others, we're benefiting. And that's why as we continue to work through a lot of these issues, we work in coalition with those communities so that we're not creating an other, but we're working together with like-minded groups, even on issues that you might think are only specific to the Muslim community. Certain state laws that are being pushed out there about not allowing certain types of religious law. People feel like those are targeted towards the Muslim community. You could see it that way, but you'll also recognize that those types of laws affect our Jewish brothers and sisters. They affect Christians. They affect others. And so you work in coalition with those groups to address those issues, not pulling ourselves out and saying Muslim community versus everybody else, but as Americans working together. And I think that's the way that we need to look at it. And there's going to be obstacles, and we have definitely faced them, and people have suffered. And I don't want to downplay any of that. But it's important to be engaged and to be thinking about the problems that Americans face generally. You know, one of the things that we've tried to do in our engagement, both in the United States and abroad, is to say, look, we need to take away the focus of what we're doing with Muslim communities away simply from one or two political issues. We don't want to securitize the relationship. So we've had our engagement, even with the domestic communities, on issues like healthcare, on jobs, on the Recovery Act, on immigration, on gun control. All of these issues we've tried to do what we can to bring in people from all communities. And internationally, one of the main points that the president has made is that Muslim communities around the world have played such a pioneering role in so many areas that it would be a mistake to limit our engagement and our interaction exclusively to political issues. And so we've created a lot of partnerships in areas such as education, health, entrepreneurship, science and technology. A lot of these partnerships aren't going to get attention right now because the big political issues are the ones that continue to kind of drive discussions and get the headlines. But we feel that all these programs that we've put in place 5 years from now, 10 years from now, these seeds that we've planted, you'll start to see the impact that those types of programs have in the long term. But definitely, as a part of the work that I'm working on, I said this, the first thing I said before I took the present job, which I'm working on, which I'm working in, which is as a special envoy. And we use the OIC as kind of the hook, but it's actually broader than that. The OIC is a multilateral organization which has membership of 56 Muslim majority countries. And there's also some observers included. That allows us to have a hook to say this is our general position of engagement with the Muslim world around the set of issues that the president talked about in Cairo. So my role is to help deepen and expand the partnerships that the president spoke about in Cairo. And right from the beginning, even before I came into the position, before the Cairo speech, before the Ankara speech, one of the main points I made is that the political issues, the issues that are sources of tension between the United States and Muslim communities around the world, unless we address those issues, it's very hard to see measurable kind of movement in the public diplomacy sense from programs like education, entrepreneurship, health, science, and technology. We have to do those things because they're absolutely the right thing to do. And it's a mistake not to take advantage of the talent that exists in the Muslim world in these areas. But we've got to address these political issues. So in terms of the political issues, what we've tried to do, I'll just be very succinct, and we can, I'm sure, get into some of this in the question and answer, is first of all, to address the political issues, the issues of conflict that the president spoke about. The first thing is the president came into office inheriting 2 wars, to end those wars, to end the war in Iraq, and we're winding down the war now in Afghanistan, to make sure that we're doing everything we can to try to support 2-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians. The president, in the second day in office, appointed George Mitchell, someone of Arab descent, rather than waiting till later. Historically, in the American presidency, this is an issue that they've waited on later till a potential second term, or at the very end, or the last few weeks of a second term. But really, to get started on that right away, knowing that there's going to be a ton of ups and downs. This is an area that we've been disappointed with, but as you can see, the new Secretary of State that's come in he's already been there, I think, 3 to 4 times. He's going back May 20 and 21st, I believe, is his next trip there, and has been very focused on it. It's something that the president cares about deeply and has said that he's going to continue to be persistent on throughout his presidency. When the president came into office, we had no idea the changes that were going to be taking place in the Muslim world. And so what we've tried to do is support the people of the Middle East and North Africa through their transitions. We've gotten a lot of criticism. You've seen in the last campaign that people say the president threw our allies under the bus too early. So you hear from both sides. A lot of people say that we knew Mubarak at least, and we knew some of these other leaders, and now because we didn't support them, we call for them to go. There's new people that have come into power that we don't know so well, and that's leading to this and that. It's a mess, and it's taking too long, and what's happening to the rights of minorities, issues that we're very focused on. but we felt that we had to stand on that side, and that's what we try to continue to do. Now, in terms of a lot of the issues with regard to anti-Islamic sentiment, if you look at a lot of the statistics, and some of these statistics came out at the time of, it was very clear at the time of the Ground Zero debate. I think there was a statistic that said that 70% of Americans opposed an Islamic center near Ground Zero. So when you have a number like that, it tells you that there's obviously this link that for some reason people have between Islam itself and what happened on that day. Because there's nothing that, it's a masjid, a place of worship, a place of peace, has nothing to do, obviously, with what happened on 9/11, so why should there be opposition to a place of worship like that? So when you have that type of misinformation and misunderstanding out there, and what many people have cited as a kind of a tidal wave of anti-Islamic sentiment, what we try to do is make sure to go against that and try to take the right position on issues that come up, such as that controversy which the president spoke on, such as what Terry Jones was trying to do, such as this film that came out last September, which someone was trying to provoke, obviously, differences, and led to protests and violence, and in some places where the president came out and said that the future cannot belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. Trying to do that at a time when obviously the tide is going in the other direction. If you look at what a lot of other political leaders have done, particularly in the Western world, a lot of them have simply played into that sentiment and have made statements, to the effect that multiculturalism is dead. They've made statements opposing immigration in large numbers to Europe. Obviously, there's a contingent of people in the United States that some of that anti-Islamic rhetoric resonates, but really trying to go against that at a time when obviously for him, when the attacks that people have made because of some aspects of his background, he's a Christian, but having a name, Barack Hussain Obama, the types of attacks people made, trying to, despite all that, go against the tide on a lot of those issues has been something that we've tried to do. And then finally, as I said, not just focusing on a lot of the political issues or issues with terrorism, where, by the way, one of the things that we've tried to make clear every time there has been an attack or an attempted attack, it reminds us of the resilience that this country has. At the hands of people who call themselves Muslims, you have an attempt to blow up a plane over Detroit, an attempt to blow up Times Square on New Year's Eve. You've had a Fort Hood massacre. You've had the attacks in Boston. And so, on the one hand, you would think, wow, with all of that having happened, how can there not be kind of this huge sentiment? But I think part of the credit goes to the fact that as a country, we've learned a lot, we've become more resilient, we understand what these people are trying to do, and the president has been very clear every time something like this has happened that this has nothing to do with Islam, it has nothing to do with any religion in Cairo, and he even quoted from the Quran on these issues. So in addition to those security issues and political issues and issues of anti-Islamic sentiment, we want to make sure that we're engaging on issues that are important for the country at large and important for the world at large. And that's why we've tried to do everything we can to partner in areas such as health, education, entrepreneurship, science and technology, interfaith dialogue. Obviously, there's a lot going on right now. You pick up the newspaper, you'll see that things that are happening in the Muslim world, pretty much from front to end kind of dominate a lot of those discussions. And I've had a lot of interesting discussions about, when I've traveled in the Muslim world, about, yes, here's what the United States has done. We've had debates. There's a long history of mistrust, obviously, which has been built up over decades and decades. We understand that's not going to change in a matter of 2 or 3 years. We really have to take the big steps and plant seeds in other areas. But we also have frank discussions about what 1.6 billion Muslims around the world can be doing as a community of people that has no shortage of manpower, that has no shortage of natural resources, that has no shortage of wealth, and that has no shortage of talent. And so we've had discussions about how we can work together, what we can do. I feel very much a part of the Muslim community with my upbringing, and it's important to me to have those discussions as well. And we've had opportunities for interesting discourse and debate on those issues that I think have been productive and have led to good partnerships in a number of areas. And so that briefly is what I've tried to do with some of the opportunities that have presented themselves of just simply being I think someone like many people in this room, and just having been at the right place at the right time. You never know. We say in the Quran, "Wallahu khairul makirin." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best planner, and sometimes you don't really have a choice. You're put in a certain place at a certain time, and you're kind of put forward to do something, and it's a matter of trying to do what you can to stay true to your belief system and trying to contribute in whatever field that you select. And so I look forward to continuing the discussion. Every time I speak to an audience like this, invariably I try to keep in touch with those of you who want to keep in touch in the future, to talk about your future plans, and benefit from each other's experiences. So again, Jazakumullah khairan, thank you so much for welcoming me here, and look forward to our discussion.
So thank you, Rashad. I know many of you are getting ready to leave. We also have another wonderful speaker here, so if you can give us a little bit more time, it will be exciting. Rashad, I have a couple questions for you to think about now that hopefully we can get into during the Q&A period. So from what I understood of your talk, you gave us essentially 3 parts. One was your own biography, and then from there you talked about the importance of not otherizing ourselves, and rather working in coalitions with other groups according to whatever our causes are. And then third, you spoke about the anti-Islamic sentiment. So regarding the point about coalitions, Muslims as a community, are there any groups that you would suggest that we especially must work with? Are there any groups that you would suggest that we should not work with? And part of the question would of course be that, all right, from the perspective of Islamic law, Islamic thought, there might be some groups whose own goals might seem to run counter with us, right? And so this is something to think about. In addition, regarding the anti-Islamic sentiment, you made the point that the president has been very, very outspoken in speaking against a lot of this anti-Islamic sentiment, but the criticism would also be that many of our foreign policies are contributing to this anti-Islamic sentiment, and so this is another thought for you to address during the Q&A. Okay, next we have Dr. Hatem Bazian. I mentioned that he's a lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley. In addition, he is also one of the founders of the Zaytuna College, which is the first Muslim liberal arts college in the country. And I bring forward Dr. Hatem. We will break for prayer, for Maghrib prayer, at the end of our program, which still gives us plenty of time. So Dr. Hatem.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a pleasure being here with you today, and hopefully we'll have a discussion about Islamophobia and the othering of the Muslims and the process of the othering. Appreciate Rashad's speech and talk about his experience, which is very critical and important because we have to have a multi-dimensional approach to confronting Islamophobia, which is a real challenge for the Muslim community, not only in here, but across the world. Now, first, I think we need to contextualize Islamophobia to think of the history of racial discourse in the Western experience. Without thinking of the camel in the middle of the room, not the elephant, right? Without thinking of the history of racial discourse in the Western experience, we would miss to understand some of the underlying causalities for Islamophobia. Islamophobia, or bigotry and racism toward Muslims, is not the exception in Western history. Right? If we think it's an exception, then we have really missed reading the history of racial discourse and the history of otherization, whether be it in Europe or here in the Americas. Now, if we think of the history of race, critical race theory actually originates in European discourse relative to Muslims and Jews. And therefore, if we think of the Inquisition, the expulsion of the Muslims and Jews in the 13th and 14th century and into the beginning of the 15th century, part of the discourse in Europe was to differentiate between what is European, what is pure blood, and what was to be thought as not Muslim, not Jews, and therefore the concept of Europe being a Christian continent emerges at that time through the process of expulsion, through the process of removing what at the time was seen to be impurities. And therefore, the concept of race emerges at that critical point in time. And as Columbus gets lost on his way to India and the Native Americans discover that he's lost, right? That racial configuration in Europe is actually comes and becomes part of the initial development here in our own Western experience in terms of the Western societies. And therefore, what was experienced in relations to Muslims and Jews in Europe becomes experienced by Native Americans to begin with, and then it gets systematically incorporated into the treatment of African Americans through the transatlantic slave trade. And I want you to make the correction because the transatlantic, the Atlantic Ocean did not trade slave by itself. It has to be recorrected. European transatlantic slave trade. Otherwise, there is no identity to the process and the structure of enslaving between a low of 20 million to possibly a high of 70 million being taken forcefully from Africa into the New World. Now, I'm pointing this because you have to speak of the camel in the middle of the room, race, racialization. That is part and parcel of our history, and we have not yet seriously began to deal with this issue. Right? The same experience is transferred to the Chinese when the Chinese arrive in here in the late part of the 19th century with the Chinese Exclusionary Act 1882 and does not get removed from the books really until the immigration reform of 1965. Then you have to go through the Japanese experience. You also have to go through the Jewish experience in America. And as we was driving, we were seeing some of the synagogues. It was the history of this country where you have deeds where lands should not be sold or could not be sold to blacks or Jews. So the recent success of the Jewish community in America is of a recent occurrence. And we need to be aware and cognizant of that. Latinos, likewise, have been discriminated against. The walls that are being built on the Mexican border and the restrictions directed at them, this has a long history as well. Now, what I'm trying to point to is that you cannot leave that history, and Muslims for a long period of time were happy that they're not part of that history. And 9/11 basically got us to the point that, you know what, you're going to be racialized. So Muslims go through the process of racialization and they meet the racial paradigm post 9/11. They no longer are the success community with white picket fence and mansions and buildings and businesses. Now you are seen as the new racial group that is being otherized. And there's a debate whether we fit below the African Americans or above the African Americans. And some Muslims don't want to identify with African Americans. And I said, what type of intelligence you have? Right? Really, just as a basic conception, if the two prominent heroes for Muslims in this country, you have Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. And so far, I have not seen anybody respond to 9/11 questioning better than Muhammad Ali, even at his age with his disease. He was asked, how do you feel that the attackers share your faith, right, or share your religion? He responded, how do you feel that Hitler shares yours? And he just moved on. with his Parkinson's disease, he's still faster and more intelligent than many of us who are not understanding the basic history and cartography of this country, meaning individual acts should not be used to create a class that is discriminated against. So Muslims as a class are being discriminated against. And they're being otherwise in the American and European society for a number of reasons. Right? For a number of reasons. Now, there are some that are going to ask the question, but the Muslims are not a racial group. But they don't understand racialization does not have to pass through race as a social category. Race is a socially constructed category. Right? It's constructed and refined during the 14th, 15th century. But if you read the literature on race and racialization, it is not your skin tone is the only factor. You could be racialized because of your skin color. You could be racialized because of your language, and there are some countries where language groups are discriminated and there is a racial structure formed around them. You could be racialized as a religious group. Right? The Jewish community was racialized in Europe, even though in certain areas they're as white in terms of skin tone as their neighbors, but that did not prevent them from being racialized. Or if you take the case in Bosnia, where whites of the same racial background were subject to racialization based on race, based on religious identity, not based on skin tone. Political differences also could be used as a way to racialize a particular group. So what we need is actually to understand the racialization process and the literature on the racialization process, because some Muslims are not comfortable saying, well, I'm not comfortable with the concept of race and racialization, because they have at least an instinctive reaction to race, in particular because they feel themselves as outsiders to the American racial configuration. And part of it also, we all epistemologically have adopted a racial matrix. If you're an immigrant and arrived in this country, you arrive with a completely formed racial matrix. Right? If you don't account for that, then you have not understood the global process of globalization of racial identity. Right? For example, I travel a lot, and many places you take pictures of the posters and the ads that are there. Most of the faces are white that are placed, even though that the majority of the society that those ads are there are actually dark complexion, even some places that are black. Because we have created a racial hierarchy that make the superior to be white, and anything below is inferior, that have to change and alter their behavior to the level of putting fair and beautiful, that cream, which is one of the most widely distributed. I use it all the time. Just a joke. As a way of burning your skin in order to become lighter. But look at the absurdity of it. Individuals with light skin tone, they go and sit in tanning salon, right, in order to get darker. The human being is a very, very, what you call, I don't want to say difficult specimen, but you could see that these socially constructed phenomena have become part and parcel of a global discourse. A global discourse, and we need to account for it in thinking about Islamophobia and the otherization of Muslims. Otherwise, we make a mistake, right, of thinking it's only an issue that is very isolated to the Muslim community. And it's only this particular period in history, and it's not transhistorical in terms of its impacts and its consequences. Added to this is that when we think of Islamophobia, we have to think about the rising racism that was carried through the bandwagon or the cart of racism and discrimination toward Muslims. Now take President Obama. 2008 campaign, he's attacked, right, because of his supposed Muslim identity. Right? He is a closet Muslim. And so much so that he was unable to go out and say what's wrong, I could be a Muslim, and there's nothing wrong. It took Colin Powell to say that statement on his behalf because of the atmosphere in this country. But my contention in here is that they did not want to attack him because of his blackness, because many were uncomfortable with his blackness. So instead of confronting his blackness as the real concern and not wanting a black person to be in the White House, they found comfort in jumping on Islamophobia, attacking him without having to be discredited for their attack on a black person. And therefore, Islamophobia make it possible to attack individuals on racial terms, but using Islam and the threat of Islam or the connection to Islam as a way to extend this attack on Obama as well as in others. As such, Islamophobia becomes a signpost for racist discourse to occur and take place against individuals that have nothing to do with Islam or Muslim, or to rationalize this discourse. Now the second part of, and I haven't yet even went to define Islamophobia, but I'll get to that. In addition to this aspect of the discourse in terms of using Islamophobia as a way to reassert particular racial discourses in our country, which has been discredited, at least from the Second World War onward. No one in their right mind can actually assert in a credible way a racial argument. But now we have another layer. We're using cultural difference, and that's where you have the clash of civilization and clash of culture as a way, once again, to reintroduce racist discourse by means of cultural difference and clash of civilization. And in this sense, I would say we have to still give credit to Edward Said, because he flipped this argument on its head. He's saying what we have is a clash of ignorance. Because civilizations, if there is actually true civilizations have constantly have dialogues, interaction, communication, borrowing, and so on. It's only a clash of ignorance that bases or looks at difference as not part of the empowerment, but rather as part of the weakness. So let me jump into a little bit of definition of Islamophobia and then get into some of the other items that I want to do. Islamophobia is a fear and hatred of Islam and Muslims that translate to individual, ideological, and systematic forms of oppression that supports the logic and rationale of specific power relations toward Muslims. And so, once again, a fear and hatred of Islam and Muslims that translate into individual, ideological, and systematic forms of oppression that supports the logic and rationale of specific power relations. Not everyone in America is Islamophobic. Actually, the report that was done by Wajahat Ali, Fear Inc., points that there's actually a very small, dedicated group that is engaged in financing, in funding, in speaking and promoting Islamophobia in this country. And critical in this is the utilization of the internet, the utilization of websites, utilization of media outlets in order to promote a particular aspect of hatred toward Muslims. But the problem is not the small group. The problem is often the silence of the majority, which Martin Luther King challenged us in the 60s, because the majority that stays silent is actually that gives power to the Islamophobes and makes their statements the statement that everybody relates to and interact, which is for us, there is a lesson in that, in how for us to be effective in countering that dedicated group that spent up to this point, which I think the Fear Inc. report possibly did not account for everything, $46 million were spent from post 9/11 until 2010 on actually promoting Islamophobia in our in our country. And as such, we need to know these individuals. I would encourage everybody to read the report. It's available for free online to understand, because most of the time, these individuals that you see on TV speaking about Islam are individuals that are funded by the Islamophobic production complex that we have, with a specific intent of demonizing Muslims for a particular reason, and I will get to that reason. America and Europe are changing demographically. America and Europe are changing demographically. That change of demography is not because Muslims, whether it's in North Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or in Turkey, or Iran, or Palestine, or Pakistan, they're not sitting, let's plan how to take over Europe. Or you know what, I need to leave Hyderabad, and I want to conspire to take over America and come to Chicago to work and make chicken tikka masala for the streets. Right? This assumption that you see it on the website that the Muslims are taking over America and taking over Europe, it seems that they've been planning for the past 400 years. And they pick some text from the Quran, a few verses. Chapter 9, it's the favorite of Fox News and the Islamophobes. Right? And they use some of the most distorted translation. Right? And a couple of hadith here and there, and then pick and choose from history, because history, you could just give me a history book and I could mine it to make a point for you and against you with the same text. Because that's what history provides you. But if you already want to construct a particular paradigm that Muslims are coming, so if your car breaks down, it must be a Muslim in there, right? Right? That's the construction. But there is a lack of a questioning of why this mass movement that are taking place on a global level. Why this immigration is occurring. And why is it that countries that supposedly speak French, their immigrants end up in France? And many of those countries where speak English, they end up in England or the United States or Canada. There's something missing in here. Well, we have to draw a little bit back, and I think history is difficult because in here our history is only about 2 days. There's a history of colonization. There's a history of failed programs of development. There's history of WTO, World Trade Organization. There's history of GATT, General Agreement, Trade and Tariffs, that have wreaked havoc in many of these economies, including our economy down the south in Mexico during NAFTA. And thus you have a massive dislocation. On top of this, a high birth rate, not because they're Muslim, it's just poor people tend to have more children. The birth rate has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with economic well-being. That's why Muslims in this country, their birth rate is comparable to their neighbors, 2.5, possibly 3. While Muslims across other countries, right, they have 6, 7, 10, because poverty is a better indicator of birth rate than anything else. So if you want to change the birth rate, you have to actually develop them economically and invest in such a way where it's no longer possible for you to say it's an economy of investment for me, right, and I need to take from you. The reason that you have this displacement, high birth rate, failure of economic programs and projects that spans the whole, from the Second World War until now, and oppressive regimes which we have been engaged and in bed with, results in this constant dislocation. And where do people go from throughout history? They go to places where they find jobs. And they move, and they try to find a different life. In Germany, which we actually met with the members of the German parliament came to meet with us to discuss about the problems that they have with Muslims in Germany. Right? And my argument is that you have a problem because you have accepted to bring in a large labor force after the Second World War into Germany to build the economy after the destruction in the Second World War. And so far, from the Second World War until now, you still consider them to be outlanders, outsiders. That they've been visiting since 1945. And these are individuals that rebuilt the German economy with large labor force from Turkey and other countries. So you have to account for history and failure, economic programs, and dislocation. So Muslims are coming to this country not to try to take over, they're trying to get some jobs, they're trying to develop, to have a family, and live normally. But for individuals who are not comfortable with the changing that is taking place, demographic change, that's why Huntington book about the clash of civilization, then he says he actually targeted the Latino as the biggest threat because of their large number and the fact that they don't integrate in society, they keep their language. So his second book, when he wrote his book, I said thank you, because all of a sudden he gave me a very strong alliance with Latinos, right? Because in the first he was attacking Muslims. When he started writing Latinos, I said, you made my case for building coalitions with the Latinos, because the new America is different than the America of the 1950s. And we're not here collectively, right, on somebody else's dime. We're here on our own dime. Other than the Native Americans, we all just came in this country and got our green card, right, in the process. Oh, another sign of creeping Sharia. They call it green card, right? Green is the most favorable color for Muslims. So everybody in here that arrived and have worked hard, sometimes from can't see in the morning till can't see at night still, and developing themselves and being in here. And Latinos in this, for me at this particular time, they have been at the forefront of facing the consequences of Islamophobia. 2.5 million Latinos have been deported post 9/11, from post 9/11 till today. And we're still trying to militarize the Mexican border, but the Canadian border is still wide open with no walls. And I asked the person from in terms of thinking about the securing the border. If a Muslim wants to infiltrate to the United States to commit a terrorist act, which border would he or she cross? Which border? The Canadian border, because most Muslims either been colonized by the British, English speakers, or they're colonized by the French, they are French speakers. If anyone, Muslims who wants to come outside to try to infiltrate to the US from the Mexican border, no habla español. He has to take 2 years of Spanish in Mexico before he could know how to go up north to try to cross the Mexican border. And therefore, when we think of the debates in our country, the debates in our country is using Muslims as the patsies for the cultural clashes and discussions and debate of what shape of America it is to be in the future. And the same debates are taking place in Europe, specifically about what type of Europe would it be, how to actually have multiculturalism, how to have a multi-faith communities in there that's not only tolerated but embraced. And for me, it's not enough to tolerate. Tolerance implies that I'm going to hold my nose and tolerate your presence in here. What we need is a culture of embracing diversity, of appreciating diversity. Not only in diversity of somebody who agrees with us, that's not diversity. It's actually to have somebody that profoundly disagrees with you and you're ready to embrace him as being part of the society. Today, the tolerance for the Muslims is that we tolerate you as long as you look like us, drink like us, do everything like us, then we are tolerating your presence. And I'm not interested in that discourse because every human being is a valuable human being. Every human being should be appreciated for who they are. Every person with their skin tone, with their language, with their background has to be part of the large table, right, that we call the table of civilization. That's the challenge for us that we need to push. And that's what is being confronted with us. Now, what we're having the responsibility essentially is to defend and argue for the ideals of the society. Right? Preamble, all men are created equal. That's what we have to argue for. Not because of expediency, and that's my critique, not because all of a sudden the hammer is on our head, we all of a sudden became universalist, right? Hug anybody inside so they could take the hammer from you, away from you. No, because it's a principle for me. It's a principle is embedded for me in the Quran and embedded for me in the tradition of the Prophet. That's what it means, that all of us are created equal. At the core, all of us are the same. And therefore, that's what we're being challenged to rise up, to take this into our own hand and push away at those who try to use racialization, politics of division, to use animosity of one group or the other in order to maintain power in the status quo. Because what the argument is this change is stripping us away from our power. And you see the argument after the 2012 election with Obama victory. If you haven't and you watch Fox, you would think that you were living in another country. And you might be living in another country if you watch how they reacted to the election, because all of a sudden they realized that America that they were thinking about is not the America that showed up, is not America that went out, is not America that elected Obama again, is not America that they were thinking were having it in the bank, but it turned out the bank was already empty and the shape of America was completely transformed. And that's why just today there was the debate about immigration. Do you think that Republicans would have come back for an immigration reform package, haven't they, without thinking about the large number of Latinos that have voted for Obama, and therefore if they want to see their future political career, and that's why politicians only look where the wind are flowing with their finger, and where the wind is blowing they will go. Therefore they realize that future political survival is contingent upon having a strong Latino presence within the Republican Party, and from the 1980s they have structurally opposed the Latino community, beginning with Proposition 187 in California, having developed structural animosity toward the Latinos, and all of a sudden they wake up after the election and they have to catch up. And that's why you see almost a titanic shift that occurs in the Republican Party, and now they're talking about normal path to citizenship, even though there's few crews from Texas is arguing against. They are realizing that you can't win in the future in Texas, you can't win in the future in California, you can't win in Colorado, you can't win in Arizona, Nevada, and in some other states because of the heavy presence of the Latino population and the change in demographics that is occurring in front of us. A similar case could be made in Europe, with different countries having different experiences. England have a different experience than Germany, Germany having a different experience than France, and so on. But it is showing and knowing that there is a change that is taking place, and that change, for those who want to maintain the status quo, they are uncomfortable and unprepared. But I think the genie is out of the bottle and the train have already left the station. It left the station when colonization began because it opened the door for those economies to be dependent to the colonial motherland, and that colonial motherland continues to receive these immigrants. And until we realize those dynamics, which means we have to invest in those economies, just like we're investing in our own economies, because it's not a zero-sum game. That's the message that we need to take, and therefore we have to take a far more active engagement in analyzing the situation and also creating the opportunities for us to change. My last, and I know you're going to give me the 1 minute. This country respects dissent and respects people that bring ideas to the table. Meaning, we need to be individuals that come forth with a very solid engagement of what is the ideas for the society, and don't be afraid to dissent with the common thread that is taking place. But you need to come with that perspective, and it has to be inclusive of everyone. No one likes just me politics. It's in our best interest. We're only 1.5%, so even if we got each one of us 10 children, there's no way that you're going to have a demography that alters the perspective in this country. It's 1.5%, and therefore it would be insane if we don't actually build coalitions with individuals and communities that have common interests with us. But also we have to be discerning on coalitions that we should not be part of, because I'm not interested in a coalition that wants to suppress minimum wage. That's not really what I want. I'm not part of a coalition that wants to prevent organic food from being actually available, from labeling food where you know actually where the food that you're eating is from. I'm not interested in a coalition that wants to shift more jobs overseas for 13 cents on a dollar, or 800 in Indonesia will collapse a building collapse. I'm not interested in. I'm interested in real coalition that is based on ethical and moral values, And that's what makes it change, and that's what will be our contribution, and that's what I think Islamic tradition calls for me and for everyone to embark on. Assalamu alaikum, jazakumullah khair.
First and foremost, he gave us a reading assignment. This is to read Fear Incorporated, which you can find online in PDF form. Now, about Islamophobia. He gave us a very strong context that there's this racialization taking place of Muslims in America right now. By the way, I think that's Rashad's little child. So there's this racialization taking place of Muslims right now. And it's the same racialization that took place against the Native Americans, against the African Americans, against other communities. What about your argument that Islamophobia, for how bad it is actually not really that bad, right? It's overplayed, often in the same type of sensationalism that we get from people who are saying that the Muslims are secretly trying to take over. That's question number one. The other question is that related to this concern about Islamophobia within the Muslim community, is there a problem of overcompensating this sense of being a victim of what's taking place in our society? Because it seems to me that many times, whenever there's an attack, big or small, against Muslims in America, it's on every person's Facebook page. And so is that creating a whole victim complex? Good. And then a question for both of you to think about, and hopefully we can get to it. Both of you gave very fantastic presentations, but I don't know what you needed. I don't know that you needed to be Muslim for your presentations, except the fact that you are Muslims living this. What is there that is Islamic about what you are suggesting? If we had two Christians here, two Jews here, etc., I feel that they would be saying exactly the same thing that you both said. And so this is a question I'd also like to get to. Now, questions. So the cards are going around. I think anyone else has questions to pose, please grab them. So here comes the first stack for me. Okay. So, and the questions that I pose are for both of you. First question, can you comment on the media coverage of the recent events in Boston and the Sarnez brothers? So these are the two brothers who are accused of launching the bombs in Boston. Let's start with Dr. Hatem.
On the commenting on the bomb, or at your question?
The question says, can you comment on the media coverage, but feel free to take some or all of the questions.
Well, I think the media, once again, tries to outdo each other in terms of running to the story. And the generalization, the over-emphasizing the religious aspect or the religion becomes the overdriving aspect of the coverage. And I actually am writing an article on, Boston bombing, Islamophobia, and the sudden ignorance syndrome. Encountering, this concept of sudden jihad syndrome. It's almost everyone, every major Islamophobic figure found life, and I would say that possibly they were having high fives on the fact that the event happened. Now we could get back into being asked on the major news to pontificate about Islam and Muslims and what's wrong with Islam and what's wrong with Muslims. So I would say that there was so much overgeneralization, and all these talking heads that were at least pushed to the side for over the past few years have reasserted themselves into the major conversation, and now once again got another license and a lease on life, and the media became engaging once again in a whole cycle of using those individuals and these generalizations in covering the events. At the same time, there were some voices that were breaking through, and that's positive. I think Dean Abdullah in CNN was very positive. They gave him considerable airtime. I saw Wajahat was covered. Harris Tareen was covered. Individuals from Impact. So there is already some emergence of voices. But for me, if you have 100 negative and then you have 2 positive, what is the net effect? And this is where resonance as a concept in media is very important. That resonance is once you repeat something over and over, it almost becomes embedded into your subconscious. So the 2 positive becomes almost incidental to the whole process of cementing the negative, while the positive is actually tangential and not firmly established. And that's in terms of the coverage.
Rashad, do you have any comments on the media coverage?
Yeah, well, one of the first points that I'd make, from the government perspective, having worked through this period, is that we tried right from the beginning to make sure the day of the attacks, the day after attacks, to say that we shouldn't jump to any conclusion. And even after the capture and killing of one of the suspects, that was something that the president said very clearly, is that you shouldn't use this to blame any entire group of people. And so there's certain things you can do from the government, but obviously public perception is formed by much more than what the government says or what the president says. Second point is that it's very important to be careful about how we describe what constitutes journalism in media, because a lot of the really irresponsible stuff that I saw happened to be was people that just happened to have an opinion and can put up a blog, and that's now, in this day and age, unfortunately, where information and everyone's looking for the fastest information, that's considered journalism somehow. And so we have to kind of delineate between what's happening in the kind of traditional mainstream press, what's happening on the blogosphere. And the reason why I say that is I realize that can have just as a harmful impact wherever it's happening, but in terms of formulating a strategy for how to deal with that, it's important to make sure that we are addressing this broader issue of how we deal with a blogosphere that's being taken more credibly in some instances than it should be. That's a problem that's a greater problem than what we saw in the aftermath of what happened, whether it was to the student who had disappeared from Brown being brought into this, or the 20-year-old Saudi student who was a victim himself, who was cited by some people as a suspect. That's a symptom of some of these other larger problems that we're facing. But there's also a question of the fact that in terms of strategy to address this problem, what can communities be doing? I think everybody would agree that the American people are good-hearted, well-intentioned people that don't want to be steered in the wrong direction, but when you're bombarded by information that's going the wrong way, that has an impact on people. And so when they repeatedly see or hear images of people saying, I committed such and such act because of my religion, and I'm doing it in the name of my religion, then that starts having an impact, especially if you compound that with these other problems that we just discussed. And so there has to be efforts that are educational efforts done at the grassroots level to deal with these problems on a day-to-day basis in your conversations, in the organizations that we work with, in the companies that we work with, in the schools that we go to. There has to be constant dialogue with editorial boards of major newspapers, of not just major newspapers, local communities need to be sitting down with the editorial boards in their local communities. They need to be sitting down with the local newscasters and saying, for example, with issues of terminology, here are terms that are actually counterproductive. Those conversations absolutely have to be happening. Otherwise, people that are well-intentioned can be steered into the wrong direction if you don't have people working on the other side that can be doing the things that are necessary. These should be happening at the university level. The editorial boards, there should be students that are on the editorial boards, of course, of all of these papers that are familiar with these issues, but there should be once or twice a semester the students sitting down with the editorial boards of the school paper and saying, here are some common issues that are misunderstood. So it's important to realize that most people don't want to be steered in the wrong direction, and as we've seen, a lot of this misinformation is coming from a small group of people that's been well-funded to create these types of problems. And so the majority, this is an area where
again, the country is changing, the demographic is changing, and some of these tactics that are being used are desperation tactics because they see the country changing. And so in order to win out with the great majority of people who don't want to be misinformed and want to see things go in the right direction, we have to be doing our part as well to make sure that that we are engaged in a productive way to address some of these issues.
Given current global power dynamics, are we ready for interactions between the West and developing countries for the improvement of those countries? Is there potential in the near future for positive interactions, given that so far it's taken the form of neoliberalism, military intervention, IMF loans, etc., or detrimental IMF loans? This is a question that's addressed primarily to Dr. Hatem, but I'll ask both of you to answer. So go ahead, Dr. Hatem.
Yeah, I'm very critical of the neoliberal economic model. I was very critical of the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and actually organized a conference between Canadian, U.S., and Mexican intellectuals at the time to try to argue that it's not really modeled on the European Union. It made capital possible for capital to move, but not people, and allowed an intrusion into the Mexican economy without putting structurally, uplifting the Mexican economy in a similar way where the European Union, because I did my master on Middle East economic integration using the European Union as a model. The European Union, actually part of their charter is that the economies that were less developed than the northern European economies, like Germany, the Scandinavian countries, or England, they actually invested in those economies in order for those economies to be on par or competitive with the rest of the European Union. So when there's a complete opening of the borders, movement of capital, movement of resources, and movement of people, there would not be an incentive for a mass migration of Greek labor force into other areas, or Portuguese and so on. In NAFTA, we actually made sure not to include the movement of people and not to include the investment in the Mexican economy. And what we did, we developed the Mikladoras on the border in order to shift our production that has toxic waste, environmental pollution. We made sure that there is no protection of labor union and organizing, and no respect for union. So when we went down there as part of NAFTA, it resulted in the mass shifting of labor, in particular farmers, away from that. It was part of NAFTA, also required some changes in the Mexican constitution relative to public land. So if you want to speak about why we have a large influx of Latino immigrants in the United States, you have to look at NAFTA and its impact in that way. So many of these economic development programs, the World Bank rate of failure is 50%. And if you go to your professor and say, at 50%, I would like to have an A and to give me another round, he'll tell you to get out and take the class again. So we have a world institution, the World Bank, that has a 50% failure rate in the project and the program. And therefore, we need to rethink the modalities of how we actually relate to economies. I don't like to use the lesser developed economy because the index of development is problematic in itself. It's highly leveraged to particular indicators. We need to find different methods and different ways to improve and develop the economies in partnership, where the emphasis in partnership is on their partnership, not on our direction. Much of the economic programs has been set to actually benefit our economies first and foremost. And I think that I don't see it changing, but that's where the struggle that we have to undertake in order for us to really alter the picture. Now, somebody will jump and say, well, the underdeveloped world is corrupt. And I always come back with this. Their corruption would be in the millions. Our corruption is we take countries. And therefore, corruption has been embedded in our system, and we just have rescued the banks, $775 billion in our own country. If you take that, the number one corrupt person outside in the third world, they would be so happy to have 5 billion. For us, when we make these comparisons, we come back, essentially we say they're not deserving of our continued investment with them. while the same argument is not made for Wall Street, where we continue to invest with them. And therefore, I would say that becomes a racialized logic in how we relate to countries outside. So I'm always very clear and critical to decipher what is being said and take it. In Berkeley, we deconstruct everything, right? But to deconstruct it in order to understand what is the value that is embedded in it. Essentially saying we don't want to undertake another program, which at the core of the program that we developed, the money came back to our own coffers anyway. It never left or just funneled around from bank A to bank B. And you could read, I recommend for you the Confessions of Economic Hitman. I think it's a very quick read. It's a great book just to give you the process by which economic imperatives takes place. And as such, I recommend for us to rethink the process and rethink what is taking place and how these processes tend to become part of the continued cycle of underdevelopment rather than helping in the development process.
Rashad?
No.
Okay. I want to bring the conversation closer to our environment here, moving from big policy issues. We'll start with Rashad. This is a question for both of you. What advice or inspiration would you give to a college, MSA, MCSA, in which the primary constituents involved in dialogues on race are women? So, two big parts of that question. One, what advice would you give to MSA, MCSAs? And overwhelmingly, we're talking about females who are doing all the activist work, not to discount all the men.
Well, the guys need to step up. That's one piece of advice that's important. There's the university setting is a really essential place for a lot of important work to go on. When we have a dynamic now, and this is one of the reasons why I'm hugely optimistic, where a lot of policymakers, senior policymakers, if you look the last 10 to 20, 30 years, did they go to elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, where they were interacting with Muslims on a day-to-day basis in a whole range of activities in the same way that we're seeing now? If you look at the numbers and the demographics, there's a whole shift that has occurred. And not just the number shift, but in terms of the level of activity that's happening on campus and in other parts of our society, that is a bright spot. And that's a huge opportunity to work together on issues where virtuous goals bring us together. Now, there's always going to be the case that you don't agree with everyone on everything. And of course, there's certain principles which we have, which kind of guide when you would draw the line. But you have not just a university setting where you have an opportunity, but oftentimes university, the surrounding neighborhoods. There's so much work to be done. If you look at University of Chicago, for example, what our friend Rami Nashibi has done there, and what a lot of the students at the University of Chicago are doing to help out with the Intercity Muslim Action Network. That's a tremendous benefit for all people. And it's unfortunate that Rami sometimes will get criticized. He's trying to engage in services that are just helping people survive, basic services. And if he's working with a Jewish group that has a different position on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, he's getting grief for that, as a Palestinian himself. So it's important to have principles and to say, okay, there's certain lines that you need to draw in. But generally speaking, if you find somebody doing good and they're doing it with a good intention, and you have a difference of agreement that on another issue, but it's something that reasonable people can have a discussion about, and you're having an ongoing dialogue about that, as he is with many other people that he's working with from the Jewish community, for example, that shouldn't be it shouldn't always be seen as a barrier to working with other people. And like I said, the university setting where you have people that are living together from so many different walks of life, and people that are so open-minded, because for the first time they're being exposed to things that they may not have been exposed to, and they're just soaking in new knowledge. This is a wonderful opportunity to work on common objectives with people of all faiths and backgrounds.
First, you have to dispense with fear. Fear for people will accept all kinds of restrictions and limitations, and they are unable to alter and change their life. And I would say that there's a psychological concept which you develop into learned helplessness. Because of fear, you begin to think that you are unable to change and alter your surroundings. So as a student, as a person, as a Muslim, as any individual, you have the capacity to change the world that you're part of. So that's, for me, is the principle. Because if you can't conceptualize it, you can't actualize it. So first you have to conceptualize that I am an important person that is able to change and shape the world. And let the person in front of you react and say you can't. Because the negative can never outdo the positive of affirmation. So you have to have that conceptualization. Right? That's good. Second, for Muslim men, you don't need just to be an MD and engineer and think that your life is only focused about getting to be a doctor or an engineer, and that's how your life worthiness is measured. Alright? So Muslim families, and this is part of cultural but also historical, colonial legacy, you combine it all, that we feel that the only way for us to get married is that if I am an MD or an engineer, and I'm always praying that Muslims who go through genetic mutation and begin to have, study literature, law, even law right now, the mothers are accepting their children, they're meant to study law because they assume it makes more than $100,000. So it's actually, they're thinking of risk, right, of sustenance. So we need to begin to say that we have to have the diversity of fields that we need to include in our repertoire. And then for them actually to step up to the work that is needed, because there's a lot of work that is needed. And to help the sisters who are often the ones that are carrying much of the workload. And I think that has to change both at the local level as well as to reflect it across the community. As far as what you could do on campus, for me is limitless. One, I always encourage Muslim students, you need to run for student government. Right? You pay your fees and tuition, and the student government usually in some of the big campuses, they have $1 million, $2 million, $3 million budget. There's this group of students that make a decision to run A and not B. So you need to empower yourself and be on the table. Showing up is 50% of making the argument. Right? So run for student election. That helps you in creating and working with others, developing joint agendas and commonalities, and being able to see and talk to as many people, because you're not only going to win by speaking to the two Muslims that you know. In Berkeley, the student elections, our turnout for elections is about 15,000 plus. And therefore, that's the turnout for the student election. So you have to actually campaign hard for you to be able to win. You have to convince people about your platform and present it. It helps you in many ways. It helps you to talk to many people. It helps you public speaking, your confidence, your ability to present your case. And I would say that we had a hijabi woman that won this election at UC Berkeley, and we had another one that won the last year as well. So take that opportunity. You don't have to agree with everything that is done, but you need to be there to express yourself. You have the ability to speak, right, and do that. In addition, every campus has a newspaper, right? You have a newspaper here on this campus?
One of the best.
Okay, you have a newspaper, right? Now you know that every semester they have an ad in there where they say we are looking for volunteer reporters and orientation such and such day. If you begin as a freshman or as a junior, by the fourth year, you actually be on the editorial board. And therefore, it's easy to complain what is written about you. You have to write your own narrative. When somebody writes about you, you only can complain about their narrative. So part of it is taking yourself seriously and volunteering and going there and building your capacity. Is there a radio station here on campus? Yes. Do they ask for volunteers? You could actually go and build your own program. And you could work It trains you on media, it trains you how to cut a sound file, how to do a piece for 2.5 minutes. All those training is for free. The resources are there. So you don't have to wait for anyone to come and rent the studio, which is $200 an hour. It's all available for you here. Just volunteer and you begin to train yourself on those things. And there's a TV station, right? There's a TV station. Also work and volunteer. Now that capacity that you do on newspaper, radio, then you are able to transfer this into the internet. The internet is a major source. Right? Now, for me in my classes, I teach a class on deconstructing Islamophobia. I don't require students to write actually a paper. Because a paper, they submit the paper, I put my communist red pen, that's the joke. Right? You mark it up and give it, it's the value of it is. So actually my final project is for students to design a website on Islamophobia. In groups of 4, they design, they have to have 5 pages. Each student is responsible for 1 page, and the theme is up to them. So this semester they designed 24 websites on Islamophobia. I have a class on Muslims in America. I have 240 students in it. Their final project is to put the history of Muslims in America in a website. I had about 42 websites of them. And it becomes permanent, it becomes out there, and therefore they are engaged, and then students are required. How many of you here have used Twitter? Okay, so all you are on Twitter. Are you tweeting what type of cereal you ate in the morning? I use Twitter as an empowerment. So students have 5% of their grade on Twitter, so they actually have to tweet about the content of the class and engage and post something that other students can share. And at the end of the semester, they have to copy all their tweets and send it as part of the fulfillment of the class. And that's how you use social media as an empowerment, because education is about empowerment. Education that does not change and alter the condition of the society is for vanity. And that's what we need to use all these tools. So any students, you have everything at your own disposal. With a camera today, you could produce the same quality that somebody in the 1970s needed $150,000 just to get the camera going, just to record. You are doing it with a small camera that is almost $250, some even $100, and you're able to produce the quality. So don't be silent. Silent people never make history. Have you ever read about, mashallah, this person, he should never spoke in his life. There's no books written about silent people. Right? Even, Buddha, which is silence is part of the meditation, but Buddha is studied because of his wisdom. So he said something and then meditated. So say something and then meditate and support it. So don't be a people that say, mashallah, he's silent. No, be a people that actually speak and engage, and that's how you make a difference.
Okay, so continuing this point, where do you see the Muslim community, realistically speaking, in 50 years?
Yeah, maybe we'll make this the last one, just getting a little bit delayed here in the prayer. I think, alhamdulillah, I have a very optimistic viewpoint, and I think it's up to the community to decide whether we see that picture within 5 years or 10 years or 50 years. It can take 50 years if we're not doing the types of things that we've talked about. But one of the things that's really important to recognize is the importance of being strategic in everything that's done. It's good to have imams engaged in political issues and interested in health issues, but you can't put everything for the community on an imam. So we have great leaders. If you ask people who are the leaders of the American Muslim community, you would hear lots of names that are imams. And imams, of course, play a very important and respected role, and we love them and we benefit from them. But we can't, part of the love for them is to make sure that we're not putting everything on them. You can't be the person that has to advocate on politics. You can't be the person that has to advocate on this issue and this issue and this issue. At the same time, you're doing marriage counseling, and then the next hour you're sitting down with Secretary of State to talk about X, Y, and Z issue. There has to be a strategy that's created in which, it's not a great analogy, but sometimes when there's a lot of things going on, you need organization. Somebody will say, okay, let's bring in one of these McKenzie's types of guys, and let's come up with a plan for advancement in a few different areas. And so we need a strategy to deal with government. We need a strategy for dealing with educational issues. We need a strategy for dealing with media. We need a strategy for education. And different parts of the community have to play different roles. There may be certain issues which are wonderful issues, that are important issues that everyone should be passionate about, but it may not be the most strategic thing for every single person in the community to be working on that particular issue. If somebody is doing work in the inner city and opening up places where people learn how to use computers, where there's direct services, is it the most strategic thing to put on that person that they have to be the advocate for X, Y, and Z foreign policy issue? Or is it better if somebody else in the community is playing that role? And so it's important that as we develop our institutions, what I see is happening, that people think strategically and they say, okay, here's what the community needs 5 years from now, 10 years from now in this area. Here is a group of people that can go forward and work in that area. And that's, I think, there's so much talent. There's so much talent. There's students in this audience that I bet you if you looked at their backgrounds and their resume and what they've done, they would be, more interesting speakers than both of us. And we have that type of talent and the young talent in our community. But what's going to make a difference, the difference of whether this manifests itself and the changes that we want to see in 5 years or 50 years is whether it's organized in a way in which people take responsibility to move the community forward, critical masses of people, move the community forward in working in different areas in a strategic way, working together, building coalitions within the community and outside of the community. And if we see that, I think you'll see the progression even faster than we've seen the Muslim community progress in the last 20 years. And you'll see something along the lines that you've seen other minority communities in the United States as they become more and more empowered. And it's taken a lot longer for many of those communities. I think you'll see it, inshallah, take place at an even faster rate for the Muslim American community.
I'm optimistic in the long run about the Muslim community. The Muslim community in this country is here to stay. If you look at the demographics of the community, if you think about its institutional backbone, 2,200 mosques, hundreds of community organizations and institutions, all across the board, the community is actually maturing and coming of age. So I'm very optimistic in the long run about the community. Now, we are not different than any other community, meaning we have a host of problems, issues, challenges, and therefore we're normal. And I think to say that Muslims are normal is an insult to intelligence, but they are normal. And I should expect the array of issues that confront any other community. Also, that I am not a person that believes that we're going to have a singular type of position or leadership and so on. I think we're going to have multiplicity. Muslims in here come from almost 65 to 70 different countries. And with conversions taking place and communities emerging, including a very critical Latino Muslim community that is emerging. We just hosted them for a gathering in Zaytuna just recently. So you have a complete shaping of the Muslim community that has taken place. That's what is healthy and growing. I think we need to recognize the diversity within. And that diversity is multifaceted. And I would say, I hesitate for someone to say that I speak for all Muslims. There's nobody speak. There's only one voice per person. And until we get somebody that's elected as a representative of Muslims as a community, we should just take that we have different point of views. And these point of views are very valid and they should be respected for themselves. And we should actually encourage intra-Muslim dialogue because we speak about each other but not with each other. I don't see any intra-Muslim dialogue across the country, almost zero. There isn't a dialogue between Sunni and Shia. I know we have our press conferences and we bring the Shia Imam and the Sunni Imam and all of a sudden we are happy and hug each other. That just like for me is a PR. I'm not interested in PR. I'm interested in serious. And I'm interested in serious discussions of actually I have a profound difference with you. And if you can't handle me having a profound difference with you, then how we can grow together to understand my difference with you. And I need to tell you that this is what you're doing is wrong, because I need to say that it's my right as a Muslim brother to tell you that I see what you're doing is wrong. And you should not feel what you call, in that sense, a sense of like, oh, you can't tell me I'm wrong. Because the Prophet ﷺ told us that the person who tells you you're wrong, you should actually thank him for pointing something that was not absent out of your consciousness. So I always look for the negative comment before the positive comment, because the negative comment was something that could strengthen me. The positive comment actually does not do anything to me. So, oh, you are great. Okay, alhamdulillah. What's next? But tell me about what I did. Tell me about the statement. Do you think, oh, I think the statement should have been done this because it's much better. I say, alhamdulillah, give it to me, write it to me, send it to me, because I could benefit from it. That's called constructive criticism and building community. So I think we need to develop those processes in order for us to have a healthy community within 50 years. And I'm confident that the community will grow and will have its place in the society, regardless of the difficulties that are there. Now, I wanted to answer your question about is it that the Muslim community's Islamophobia is not as bad. It's not measuring whether it's bad, whether you have an extreme case of racism, mild case of racism, bigotry. Racism is racism, it has to be rejected. We should not compare ourselves to African Americans. The African Americans, have won the Super Bowl in terms of racism and continue to win the Super Bowl of racism toward it. And to compare is an insult to their history. But doesn't mean that we don't have comparison. We can sit in solidarity and understand how it's affecting Muslims on the one hand and how it affects the African Americans or the Latino. So similarity does not mean that you need to rank it. This ranking of suffering as a way to try to assert that the Muslims have more extreme cases of racism today versus the other. No, we're not in a Super Bowl of how racist people are toward us. No, we have the humanity of individuals are being subverted, and we need to assert that every human being should be valued for who they are, because at the core of it, that we are all been created with the Spirit of God in us, and that has to be asserted at every juncture.
And speaking of Super Bowl, athletics is so important, and we need really strong Muslim athletes. I'm dead serious. If you look at the key influencers in our society, Muhammad Ali, we already spoke about him tonight, some of the most key influencers in society. If you want a platform to speak from, you have like 5 really strong Muslim athletes. We need to make sure that we're supporting. I mean, if any profession you ask me for my son, what I want him to do, I would say make dua that he becomes an athlete. And that's maybe what I should leave you with. If you remember anything from this, lecture, please remember to do that.
Last question. This is actually
I don't want to wait.
10 seconds. I'll ask the question.
Yeah.
Everything you said is wonderful, both of you. Yeah. What's so Islamic about what you said?
Just because something can be said by a Christian and a Jew, does not make it un-Islamic.
Okay,
See, this is the wrong. It is all Islamic, all of it. That's the answer. And just because a Christian or a Jew could also say it, doesn't mean that a Muslim can't say it. And I'm pretty sure that some of the specific references we made up towards the tradition and the references that we've had probably be unlikely to be said by a Christian or a Jew.
Well, at the core of it, religion is about justice and call to moral conduct and moral action. So for me, what is Islamic is a call to justice. Right? At the end of each sermon, we say the following: إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. Allah commands to justice, to ihsan, which is the perfection of rightful duty, and also attends to your next of kin, and forbids aggression. It forbids wrong actions, and to transgress upon people. So at the core of it, the tradition, from my understanding, and religion in general, if we think of all the prophetic figures, you think that Moses came to campaign for selling F-16s? And do you think Jesus was a salesman for Chevron? All the prophetic figures were in essence standing in calling for justice. And that's what made the prophetic figures, with the magnitude and the strength that they have. And therefore, that's what is Islamic. It's a call to justice and being grounded in a moral outlook, and that's the epistemology that they come with from an Islamic perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. We had a wonderful conversation. conversations. I'm going to call up Babar. Let's give a round of applause.